Lots to cover. First, some news for you. The Australian High Court announced Tuesday that Cardinal George Pell has been granted leave to appeal his conviction for child sexual abuse. The Cardinal was convicted last December on charges that he sexually abused two choir boys after Sunday Mass while Archbishop of Melbourne. He has strenuously denied those charges. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison and must serve at least 3 of those years and 8 months before being eligible for parole. The 78-year-old cardinal, who remains an archbishop and a member of the College of Cardinals, has been held in solitary confinement and has not been permitted to celebrate Mass in prison. Cardinal Pell has maintained his innocence. His appeal to the High Court was his last legal avenue to overturn his conviction. The new appeal will be heard next year in Australia's High Court. Also this week, Pope Francis appointed a fellow Jesuit, Father Juan Antonio Guarroro Alves, a 60-year-old Spanish economist, to replace Pell as the Vatican's finance minister. And reports from Rome indicate that the resignation of Bishop Richard Malone of Buffalo, New York, may be imminent. The UK tablet is reporting that Malone may soon be stepping down in the wake of accusations that he's mishandled the abuse crisis in the Diocese of Buffalo. Bishop Malone is now in Rome with other New York bishops for their ad limina visit with Pope Francis. Malone's resignation, if true, would have to be accepted by Pope Francis, and according to the tablet, the papal nuncio in the U.S., Archbishop Christophe Pierre, has been informed of the resignation and is in favor of it. A spokesman for the Diocese of Buffalo said this week they have received no information about the resignation. We'll continue to report on this story as it develops. Well, the USCCB, the Bishops' Conference, met this week in Baltimore for their annual fall assembly. The bishops discussed a host of issues, including abortion, gun control, gun violence, immigration, and evangelization. They also elected a new president to the conference, Los Angeles Archbishop Jose Gomez, who will succeed Cardinal Daniel DiNardo of Galveston, Houston. This year's fall meeting was not without controversy. So joining me this evening to recap some of the highlights is one of its participants, Bishop Joseph Strickland of the Diocese of Tyler, Texas. He joins us from Baltimore. Your Excellency, thank you for being here. I want to start with the opening address by the Papal Nuncio, Christophe Pierre, on Monday. He had this to say about the U.S. bishops and their communion with Pope Francis. Watch.
The pastoral trust of this pontificate must reach the American people, especially as families continue to demand of dioceses and parishes the accompaniment and vision by Amoris Laetitia.
Now, the nuncio is really pressing there for the implementation in the U.S. of Amoris Laetitia. That was the controversial papal exhortation that permits divorcees without annulment to return to communion. Now, Bishop, how did you and your brother bishops receive that message? It was pretty blunt.
Well, as I sat there in the hall with my brother bishops, it didn't seem to have the impact for me personally, honestly, or the other bishops that some of the press has picked up on. It seemed pretty much in line with similar addresses that I've heard before, and in talking to other bishops, that seemed to be the tone. Certainly, those that you just quoted, the nuncio's words about Amoris Laetitia, encouraging that, and I think there's much that we have embraced in our diocese, and I think many other bishops as well. I think some of the press may be hearing it as the specific dubia or the questions about that document that certainly are still sort of in the realm of confusion, but it's really not confusing for me, and I've made it clear to the priests that there's really been, certainly we want to accompany people, we want to reach out. We've actually got a program in the diocese working with people that are in irregular marriages and really trying to reach out to them. So I think that is very much in the spirit of Amoris Laetitia and what we keep hearing beautifully from Pope Francis, reaching out to the people, going out to the margins. We're really trying to do that without changing and pulling back from what continues to be canon law and the teaching of the church regarding what is a valid marriage. So I guess I heard it through a different kind of mixing metaphors, but a different lens.
Yeah. Well, you're
with,
seeing it.
how I heard it because of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, you're experiencing it from your lived experience in the diocese, which is the right way to receive it, I think. He went on to say this, the nuncio did, about the U.S. bishops' ad limina visits that are getting underway with Pope Francis in Rome. Listen.
It may be useful and prayerfully reflect on the gift of communion with the Bishop of Rome, namely by measuring to what extent we as individuals and our local churches have received the magisterium of Pope Francis. By now, Evangelii Gaudium should be the framework for effort at evangelization. Adopting its missionary impulse and being in a permanent state of mission might represent tangible signs of communion with the Holy Father.
He refers there, Bishop, to the magisterium of Pope Francis. There seems to be a concern that the bishops are not in step with the Pope. What did you make of that suggestion?
Well, I certainly heard the encouragement, and from everything I heard at the conference this week, especially Bishop Barron's presentation on reaching out to the nuns, those who have walked away from the church, as he said, beginning at age 13, we're losing young people. So in that sense, I think there are great efforts to, as I would describe, I mean, there are many things that Pope Francis has said, but I think a basic thrust is to go to the margins, go to the disenfranchised. And what I hear, and in the presentations, a real effort to do that. I think sometimes there are differences in what we're bringing maybe to those margins. And I try to emphasize guarding the deposit of faith and bringing the richness of the faith to those margins. But I really, in talking to other bishops, and like I said, with Bishop Barron's presentation, I see a great focus, and there was a great energy in the room during Bishop Barron's presentation, really saying we need to not water down the faith. That was the third point that he made, and really reach out. So I think there is a buzz, in a sense, that reaching out but kind of leaving behind the message of the gospel. But really, we haven't heard that from Pope Francis. I mean, there are things that are confusing, and I would ask for more clarity on exactly what we are called to do. But I think we have heard, and we certainly have tried to implement in the diocese, reaching out in various ways to bring the richness of the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Later on, Bishop, in the meeting, the issue of abortion came up in the context of the faithful citizenship document that the bishops routinely issue before elections. Here's how San Diego Bishop Robert McElroy raised it.
What has been added to this letter that was not in the previous forms is a statement I believe is at least discordant with the Pope's teaching, if not inconsistent. It is not Catholic teaching that abortion is the preeminent issue that we face as a world in Catholic social teaching. It is not. I think it's a grave disservice to our people if we're trying to communicate to them what the magisterium teaches.
I absolutely think preeminent needs to stay.
I am against anyone stating that our saying it's preeminent is contrary to the teaching of the Pope, because that isn't true. It sets an artificial battle between the Bishops' Conference of the United States and the Holy Father, which isn't true. So I don't like the argument Bishop McElroy used. It isn't true. You know, we do support the Holy Father completely. What he said is true, but I think it has been very clearly the articulated opinion of the Bishops' Conference for many years that pro-life is still the preeminent issue. It doesn't mean the others aren't equal in dignity. It's just time in the certain circumstances of our church in the United States.
Were you shocked by that?
Well, I would have to say I was surprised, and it concerned me because it It speaks of divisions that we try to overcome in the body of the bishops, and we're called to seek unity. But I think that's an illustration of some very different ideas. And as Archbishop Chaput said so eloquently, I just said a few words, but he eloquently said what I could have said if I had spoken longer. And I guess I like the word preeminent, and I would put it alongside preborn. Those who are unborn are the preeminent issue. That's where life begins. As I've said in so many different settings in my diocese, if a child can't be born, then what rights are they going to be concerned about? They're dead before they leave the womb. They don't have to worry about borders or racism or any of the other issues that are absolutely we need to address in our broken society. But to me, it needs to be, as I said, preeminently the protection of the unborn is the very first front line of dealing with the sanctity of life. And as I've tried to say to others, when that isn't there, as Mother Teresa, St. Teresa of Calcutta said so beautifully, when you're not protecting the unborn, you can expect violence and murders and all the things that we see happening with hatred of each other, too much unfolding, even within families and within communities, and certainly nation to nation.
Bishop,
and if you're not, if the sanctity of the life of the unborn isn't there, then there's no sanctity of life. And sadly, that's what we're seeing.
Yeah. I want to pick up on something that Archbishop Chaput said there a moment ago. There is this narrative being spun that when one is faithful to traditional teachings, you are somehow being disloyal to the Pope. Did you feel that tension during this conference at all? Did your confreres feel it?
Not, honestly, not a lot. It probably, the most tension I felt was in that whole question of the, preeminence of the issue of abortion. Otherwise, I haven't seen that in any real direct way. And as a bishop, as I've tried to say in social media, I'm a Catholic bishop. Of course, I support the Vicar of Christ in Rome, the Holy Father. There's a lot of confusion, and I try to hold off on judgments to get clarity on what's being said sometimes. It's a confusing world we live in. It's certainly, Rome is not the single source of confusion, but there is confusion there. Yeah. There is a lack of clarity. So I would love to see more clarity, but how can there be a discrepancy between the sacred deposit of faith that talks about the sanctity of life, male and female he created them, and there's many things in the deposit of faith, and certainly the Vicar of Christ supports those. I mean, by definition, that's who he is. I think the greater clarity that we can have is going to be beneficial. Yeah,
there does seem to be this idea, and it emerged at different moments during the conference, an attempt to elevate immigration, environmental issues, these other issues to the same level as the life issue, this being a revival of the old Bernardine seamless garment vision. The bishops discussed migration at one point, and as I've reported for many years, the conference has for decades relied upon federal grants, particularly for migration, resettlement, and refugee services, to keep the bureaucracy afloat in D.C. Archbishop Dennis Schnurr had this to say about refugee levels and the impact it's had on the conference.
Migration and Refugee Services continues to downward adjust their budget to reflect the decline in the number of refugees entering our country. In 2016, MRS settled approximately 24,000 refugees. In 2017, they resettled about 7,800 refugees. In 2018, the number dropped to about 4,700. And in 2019, as of September the 30th, the number was 4,350. Staff remains vigilant and, whenever possible, proactive in pushing for more favorable federal policies.
I want to give the audience a better idea of the amount the USCCB receives in federal grants. The USCCB's Migration and Refugee Services offices received in fiscal year 2018 $47.7 million. Since fiscal year 2008, MRS has taken in over $742 million. And if you look at all the federal grant money collected by the USCCB for all its various services, we're talking $363 million in 2018, $531 million in 2017. And if you look back to 2008, the USCCB has taken in over $4 billion from the federal government. That data comes from Capital Research Center here in Washington, D.C. Bishop, quick question. With billions on the line in federal grants, have the bishops become too attached to those funds, and particularly to this issue of refugee resettlement? And we can get further into it, but I want your quick reaction to that.
Well, I honestly don't know a lot about the financial elements, but I would encourage us to certainly humanitarian crises, and there are more than one crisis in the world these days, even with the United States. I mean, you look at Venezuela, you look at many places in the world where humanitarian issues are foremost.
Sure.
I would hope that we can focus on that, and as far as the finances of it, I really don't have enough information to speak very intelligently, I have to admit. But I think we as bishops need to go back to our mission, which is, as I've said, the salvation of souls. And that is not some otherworldly focus totally. The salvation of souls happens beginning with life in the womb, and then with all the different issues that need to be navigated for a person of Christian virtue to live in this world. So all the issues are important, but I think that what I would hope we can do as a conference is more and more focus on that ultimate goal of the salvation of souls, and how do we guide people in gospel virtue to really address these issues and recognize that as bishops, it's our main job to move hearts to Christ. And if those hearts are deeply committed to Jesus Christ, He's the one that's told us how do we act, how do we treat the immigrant, how do we treat the poor, how do we treat those who have been disenfranchised. We reach out to them in the love of God and the mercy of Jesus Christ. That, I think, is what we need to focus on, is changing hearts to Christ. And then the good work that He calls us to do, each individually. I'm just a sinful man like every bishop and every human being. We are all in need of that salvation that Christ offers, and then to do the good works of justice and charity in His name.
Bishop, as you heard from Bishop Schnurr earlier, I think what concerns the laity is when you hear lines like, staff will continue to push as proactively as possible for more favorable federal policies. And look, as you said a moment ago, the poor in body and spirit, that is the obligation, the responsibility and duty of the church to care for man in temporally and spiritually. And refugee status is a prudential judgment of governments, not churches. But the church is correct, I think, in wanting to help the stranger. And I've argued for more Christian refugees from the Middle East, for instance, because these are people actually fleeing religious persecution, not economic hardship. And I think the conference has become almost, they've become very zealous about migration policy and muted their voices in other areas, particularly on the life issue, marriage, some of these other things that, frankly, the laity is crying out for.
Well, I agree, and it is difficult. I mean, as a bishop for almost 7 years now, it's challenging to deal with a multiplicity of critical issues, but that's part of what shepherding has to be. We have to try to address all of them and guide people's hearts. I guess that's what I keep going back to, because we can't do it. We're not a policy arm of the government or of anything. We're spiritual men guiding and shepherding in the way of Jesus Christ. So changing hearts is the way we can change all these issues that need to be addressed by the good people that we serve in the life of the church.
Bishop Joseph Strickland, thank you so much for joining us. What was your final takeaway from this? What did you learn here or see here that surprised you most in this week?
I guess I'd have to say that I think there is concern about focus, and there are some divisions. That the body of Christ, yes, it's divided. I mean, certainly there's division in the church. There's bound to be some division among the bishops, but let's work toward unity in Christ. He prays for unity in his body. And that's what we always have to work toward, understanding each other. And I did see some good steps in that direction with some of the things said in public, and also just in the conversations with bishops at coffee breaks and all, with a desire to, the world has so many broken aspects that need to be addressed in just humanity. They're all God's people. It's not just a segment that we're dealing with or that we should be seeking to address. Every person, every child is a child of God's.
Thank you, Bishop Strickland. We'll check in with you soon.
Okay. God bless Raymond.
Thank you.